introduction so friendly, so pointed. I resist the temptation of starting to discuss what you said in the lecture, particularly the idea that capital would not be a literary text, among other things, which my friend Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, I hope you invite him someday, one of the great Germanists and translator of Hegel, Marx, Hölderlin, and so on, has brilliantly, I don't think he's the only one who have done that, brilliantly compared to Melville's Moby Dick. And more recently, I found, to my amazement and delight, I must say, that the celebrated phrase in Marx's Capital, the expropriation of the expropriators that everybody knows, which I had already some time ago traced back to a messianic passage in Isaiah, in the Bible, where it is said, and you will oppress your oppressors, has its exact equivalent in a passage in Moby Dick, where Captain Ahab, insulting the whale in advance, exclaims, and I will now dismember my dismemberer. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm incredibly grateful to the Maison Française once again, and the French department and the ICLS for giving me the opportunity to talk about Europe and its crisis here today. And I thank you for coming at such short notice, at a moment in the day in which I know that most of you have many occupations. I want to, before even I start reading my text, allow me to read you a phrase which I just found, in fact, from an article published a few months ago, August 29, in the Washington Post, by a well-known American pundit, Charles Kupchan. How do you pronounce his name? Kupchan. The European Union is dying. Not a dramatic or sudden death, but one so slow and steady that we may look across the Atlantic one day soon and realize that the project of European integration that we've taken for granted over the past half-century is no more. And then come several pages of illustration of that idea. I indeed suspect, and you see that I'm not the only one in doing so, that a dramatic event has been taking place at some point during the past month, which I will describe as the end of the European political project, or the project of transforming Europe into a post-national entity within given borders and through the cooperation of various nation states which shared a common a certain history, admittedly complex and conflictual, and also, as a consequence, could unite around a certain idea. This was not a project of suppressing the constituting nations, but of limiting their sovereignty in the name of a greater interdependency and solidarity. It has now collapsed. Whether this end is a positive or negative phenomenon, both in terms of the interests of the European populations and peoples, whether it marked an absolute reversal of the main tendencies of contemporary history, or a shift in the balance of forces between elements which always opposed it, between elements which were in favor of the emergence of a new political entity called Europe or the European Union, and elements which always opposed it, albeit for different reasons and with different interests. or indeed a simple manifestation in the open of a situation which had already been there before, in particular at the moment of the failure of the grand constitutional project in 2005. Whether finally this end is just the end of a political project in the narrow institutional sense of the term, leaving in place and perhaps liberating the capacities of other elements of the European construction, such as the economy, the culture, the society, even the bureaucracy. Or it also means that all these elements will find themselves increasingly paralyzed and dissociated, which I tend to believe could be the case, but I certainly don't have any certainty in this respect. These are all questions that I offer for reflection and discussion, supposing that you could agree on the fact of the event itself, or the accomplished end of the European political project. But of course, there's nothing evident here. And since my conviction on this point was first formed in the moment of the so-called Greek crisis in the last spring, I will need first to return to my reflections at this time, which I expressed in the form of a set of theses published in the French web journal, internet journal Mediapart, and also partially on the English newspaper The Guardian, and now, if you are interested, to be found on the online journal Theory and Event, published by the Johns Hopkins University Press, Volume 3, Issue number 2 of 2010. Now, which thesis did I propose? The first thesis was that the financial crisis, whose effects were dramatically affecting the Greek budget, and as a consequence threatening the European banking and monetary system, was only a beginning. Within one single month, we had witnessed Prime Minister Papandreou's revelation of the real Greek debt, which had been there every day almost, new revelations about that, which had been manipulated by his predecessor with the help of Goldman Sachs. The announcement of his country's inability to repay hugely increased credit interests. An expensive European rescue loan offered to him and his country on the condition of devastating budget cuts. All this soon followed by the downgraded rating of the Portuguese and Spanish debts, a threat on the value and the very existence of the euro currency, the creation of a European security fund worth 750 billion euros, the Central European Bank's decision against its explicit rules to bail out some sovereign debt in case of necessity, and the announcement of budget austerity measures in several member states. These were the latest episodes of a crisis, and local episodes, of a crisis which had started 2 years before with the collapsing of the US housing credit, and which seemed to forecast others. Until today, they remind us that there is more than ever a risk of financial crash provoked by the huge amount of rotten stocks which have been accumulated over the last decade through the combination of unwarranted loans and the transformation of credit default insurances into financial products for speculation. The unrecoverable debts, like the blackjack in a card game, what in French we call the mistigris, are changing place and denomination. And the states, that is, the taxpayers, can't catch up indefinitely. The short-term speculation was now targeting the currencies and the public debts. The euro appeared, and perhaps still is, I'm not an expert, the weak link in the chain, and so did Europe itself. For many serious economists, there can be little doubt that catastrophic consequences are coming. The second thesis was that the Greek protest, popular protest, was end remains essentially justified. A first immediate effect of the toxic remedy applied on the Greek crisis was the angry protest of the Greek population. It is debated whether this should be seen as a coward denial of the population's own responsibility or a normal, healthy rejection of an unjust collective punishment, leaving aside the criminal episodes which have interfered at some point. It seems to me that the protest of the Greek was fully justified for at least 3 reasons. First, we have been witnessing a completely insane denunciation of the whole Greek people, not only in European journals and forums, but also in other parts of the world, including the US. The corruption and the lies of the politicians, whose beneficiaries, as elsewhere, as everywhere, are essentially the rich, cultivating tax evasion on a grand scale, were blamed on the people as such, indiscriminately. Second, once again, the government had betrayed its electoral promises without any form of democratic debate. Lastly, Europe did not display any real solidarity towards one of its member states, but imposed on it the coercive rules of the International Monetary Fund, which protect not the nations, but the banks, and promise deep and endless recession. Most serious economists agreed that this would spread the crisis, possibly leading even more inevitably to a default of the Greek treasury. In any case, rising the already high rates of unemployment, especially if the same rules were imposed on other countries whose rating on the financial market could become downgraded at any moment. The infamous PIGS, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, which incidentally was exactly what the Orthodox Party was asking for. The third thesis was that we should consider all these phenomena and tendencies not as the inevitable effects of economic constraints, more or less inevitable, but as politics which is hiding its name. The Greek were the first victims, but they can hardly be the last, of a politics of rescuing the European currency, whose strategic dispositions, mainly imposed at the time by Germany, but also backed by others, are first and foremost a general restriction of public expenses and, in addition, a rather mild control of speculation and the free movements of hedge funds and traders, already announced several times after the crisis of the subprimes and the actual or virtual crash of the US banks, of some big US banks in 2008. To this, neo-Keynesian economists, I will return to this, added another request: to move as rapidly and as completely as possible towards the creation of a European economic government, especially through the unification of tax policies, possibly also correlating and enhancing industrial investments. For want of such measures, they claimed, a single European currency would prove unsustainable. None of these measures, indeed, are purely technical. They are entirely political measures which all citizens ought to be allowed to debate, because each and every of us will be affected by their outcome. However, to the extent that it exists, the discussion remains deeply biased because essential determinations are hidden or pushed aside. Any policy of defending or devaluing a currency in the conjuncture of crisis leads to a radical alternative. Either it subjects the economic and social decisions to the power of the financial market, including its rating criteria, working as self-fulfilling prophecies, and its allegedly absolute wise judgments, or it adds to the capacity of the state and more generally the public institutions to limit the market's instability and grant long-term economic interests a primacy over short-term speculation, but it cannot be both. In its current form, under the influence of the dominant social forces, the European construction may have produced some degree of institutional harmonization. This is the second element that I suggest is brushed aside. May have produced some degree of institutional harmonization and generalized the protection of some fundamental rights, which is certainly not negligible, although often more verbal than real. Witness the recent vicissitudes of the European would-be indictment of France on the issue of Romani freedom of circulation. But contrary to the stated goals, it has not produced any convergent evolution of national economies, a zone of shared prosperity, far from. Some countries are dominant, others are dominated with respect to shares in the markets or concentration of financial capital or industrial autonomy. The peoples may not have antagonistic interests, but the nations and the states increasingly do. Third, any Keynesian strategy to generate public trust in the economy rests on three independent pillars: a stable currency, certainly, a rational system of taxes, but also a social policy aiming at full employment, or as full as possible, and increasing the popular consumption to sustain the demand. This third aspect is systematically ignored in most current commentaries, obviously not by chance. The fourth thesis that I believe to be relevant to the situation concerned the real trends of globalization underpinning the visible manifestations of the crisis. All this debate concerning the euro monetary system, which, let us not forget, some important European countries still don't want to join, including the United Kingdom, but also Sweden and Poland, and the future of Europe would remain entirely abstract unless it is articulated to the real trends of globalization. Precisely those trends which the financial crisis will powerfully accelerate unless they are politically addressed by the peoples which they affect and their governments. How can we summarize them? First, we're witnessing a transition from one form of international competition to another, no longer mainly a competition among productive capitals, but a competition among national territories which use tax exemptions and pressure on the wages of labor and ever-increasing insecurity of jobs to attract more floating capitals than their neighbors. Now, whether Europe works as an effective system of solidarity among its members to protect them from so-called systemic risk, or pushed by powerful states who are momentarily more efficient or better protected from market fluctuations, simply sets a juridical framework to promote a greater degree of competition among the member states and their citizens, this will determine the future of Europe politically, socially, and culturally. But there is a second tendency which must be taken into account, namely a transformation of the international division of labor, which radically destabilizes the distribution of employment in the world. This is a new global structure, we know, where North and South, East and West, old denominations, which I'm not sure will last forever, of course, are now exchanging their places. For Europe, or most of it, if not counteracted, it will entail a brutal increase of inequalities, a collapsing of the middle classes, a shrinking of skilled jobs, a displacement of so-called volatile productive industries, a regression of welfare and social rights, the destruction of cultural industries and general public services. This is why resistances against supranational political integration, which believe to protect the sovereignty of the states, will in fact weaken the defenses of each singular nation. They will also precipitate a return to the ethnic conflicts which the European construction wanted to overcome forever. This is, in fact, already well underway. However, and it's one of the points on which Kupchen is eager to insist. However, it is also clear that a greater political integration of Europe cannot become created from above by some bureaucratic decision. It requires democratic participation and advances in each country and the continent as such. This leads me to a fifth thesis, which takes the form of a question, admittedly a risky one, which concerns the meaning of so-called populist movements in Europe. Is it essentially a peril for democracy, or could it become also a resource? We cannot but ask the question, is this crisis the beginning of the end for the European Union, a construction that had started 50 years ago on the basis of an age-old utopia, but now proves unable to fulfill its promises? I'm afraid that the answer, unfortunately, is yes, as I said already a moment ago. Sooner or later, this will be inevitable, and possibly not without some violent turmoil, unless it finds the capacity to start again on radically new bases. Europe is a dead political project. But the breaking of the European Union would inevitably abandon its peoples to the hazards of globalization to an even greater degree. Conversely, a new foundation of Europe does not guarantee any success, but at least it gives her a chance of gaining some geopolitical leverage in her own benefit and perhaps the benefit of others. With one condition, however, that all the challenges involved in the idea of an original form of post-national federation or confederation, I don't mind the term, are seriously and courageously met. And as the failure of previous attempts would seem to demonstrate, they are anything but huge. It is a question of setting up a common public authority, which is neither a state nor a nation state, even at a bigger scale, nor a simple governance of politicians and experts, of securing genuine equality among the nations, thus fighting against reactionary nationalisms, whether on the side of the strong or the side of the weak, and above all, of reviving democracy in the European space, thus resisting the current processes of de-democratization, or, as I suggested some years ago, statism without a state, produced by neoliberalism and the colonization of its administrations by a bureaucratic caste, which is also partially the source of the corruption in the public markets. Something obvious should have been long acknowledged. There will be no progress towards federalism in Europe, the one that is now advocated by some, and rightly so, in my opinion. In parentheses, I disagree in this respect with prominent French analysts, including on the left, in the Gaullist and Mitterrandist tradition, such as former Minister of Foreign Affairs Hubert Védrine, the one who coined the name hyperpower for the United States, with whom I recently debated this issue in a French journal called Philosophie Magazine. So there will be no progress towards federalism in Europe if democracy itself does not progress beyond the existing forms, allowing an increased influence for the peoples in the supranational institutions. Does this mean that in order to reverse the course of recent history, to shake the lethargy of a decaying political construction, we need something like a European populism? In other terms, a simultaneous movement or a peaceful insurrection of popular masses who will be voicing their anger as victims of the crisis against its authors and beneficiaries, and calling for a control from below over the secret bargainings and occult deals made by markets, banks, and states? Yes, indeed. There is in fact no other name with which we can call a becoming political of the people. I agree that it can lead to other catastrophes, which is why we need strong constitutional rules to be observed, and above all, political forces to emerge again in the European arena who introduce a culture of uncompromising democratic ideals and imaginary into this post-national populism. This, of course, makes a very big set of conditions. But the risk is greater, it seems to me, if petty nationalism prevails in whichever form. This leads me to my final thesis, again in the form of a question. Where is the European left? In some parts of the world, including this one, maybe, forces aiming at the kind of peaceful insurrection that I have just mentioned were traditionally called the left. But the European left also is now bankrupt, nationally and transnationally. In the broader political space, stretching across borders, that is now relevant, it has lost every capacity to express social struggles or launch emancipatory movements. It has surrendered to the dogmas and rationales of neoliberal orthodoxy. Consequently, it has been ideologically disintegrated, deprived of any strong popular support. Name me a left political party in Europe today which would have such a support. Those parties which represent it nominally are now powerless spectators and commentators of the crisis, for which they offer no specific and collective response. They have remained passive after the financial shock in 2008, still passive when the International Monetary Fund recipes, which in other times on other continents they had vigorously criticized, Argentina, etc., were imposed on Greece. Passive again when it was proposed to rescue the euro at the expense of wage laborers and ordinary consumers. And they proved unable to launch a public debate on the possibility and the means of a Europe of solidarity. We may well wonder in these conditions what is going to happen when the crisis enters its next phases. When national policies, increasingly repressive, lose their social contents or their remaining social alibis. There will be protest movements, almost certainly, but they will find themselves isolated. Possibly they will become deviated towards violence or recuperated by racism and xenophobia, which are already surging all around us. In the end, they will produce more powerlessness, more despair. This is tragic, since the capitalist and nationalist right itself, now on the offensive, is also strategically divided. It was clear when stopping public deficits was pitted against investment policies, and it will be even more the case when the very existence of common European institutions is at stake. There was an occasion to seize, a strong word to say about, but the question also, and it was not said by the left, but the question also concerns the intellectuals. What should and could be a democratically elaborated political action against the crisis at the European level, walking on both legs, economic administration, social policy, eliminating corruption and reducing the inequalities which foster it, restructuring debts, and defining common objectives in order to legitimize transfers of tax resources between mutually interdependent nations. It is the task of progressive intellectuals, whether they see themselves as reformists or revolutionaries, to discuss this subject and take risks. And here, if I had time, of course, I should open a parenthesis, which could be long, to say that there are indeed initiatives in that sense, but they come from individuals or from very limited groups of intellectuals, however, not deprived, of course, of influence and clout in some cases. Two examples come immediately to my mind, which I want to advertise or to publicize, of course. One of them is the so-called Manifesto of European Concerned Citizens, or Manifesto for New Europe, signed by Ash Amin and others. Saskia Sassen, in particular, who teaches in that university, has posted it, in fact, on the so-called the Huffington Post. It was also published in the New Statesman and other places. And the second one, which is more recent, is the so-called Manifesto of Appalled Economists. This is more strictly French in the origin, but it also exists in English. You can find it on the web. A very interesting text. These were the questions that I was trying to formulate a few months ago and wanted to see publicly discussed in the wake of the Greek crisis. Incidentally, this crisis is not over. It has only disappeared from the television screens. 4 months later, I keep thinking that they are inevitable. Even if I repeat, I can admit that I have not found for each of them the best possible formulation. For this reason, I will try in the second part of my talk to add clarifications and therefore further nourish the discussion on 2 points, which certainly are not the only ones which need such clarification. They concern the relationship between democracy and populism and the reciprocity of economic and political determination. Let me start with the issue of populism, which is probably the most delicate, especially when you speak before an audience which I suspect broadly shares the values and historical perspectives of what a moment ago I called the left. Incidentally, a debate about the oscillations in the meaning, scope, and effects of populism is perhaps easier to start on this side of the Atlantic, in a country where the category has a long and complex history and remains used in very contradictory ways. I noticed that President Obama was called a populist when he launched an attack, attack against the tyranny of Wall Street. And I noticed, of course, that the term is also used to qualify the Tea Party movement. I have used this term a moment ago in complete awareness of the terrible ambiguities which characterize its use and meaning. I believe that they belong to the essence of the political, indicating an intrinsic risk that a politics which wants to escape abstraction and take into account real forces acting in a given conjuncture can never avoid. They also point at the issue on which a democratic politics must concentrate its efforts, both in terms of mobilization and clarification. The popular movement, which today is so dramatically missing, must be reconstructed. It must also indeed, in the middle of dangerous circumstances, acquire a moral and intellectual capacity to resist certain deviations without forgetting the lessons of tragic experiences in the past. In the debate which is perhaps starting about the renovation of the left and the resurrection of politics at the European level, other contributors prefer to insist on a civic commitment rather than a need of populism, which I perfectly understand, since I have myself long advocated in other places an extension of the category of citizenship in the active sense, including its ethical dimension at the transnational level. But I do believe that we need to use both notions. Let me try to explain. Political theorist and philosopher Ernesto Laclau, well known certainly in this audience, has insisted that the dominant conception of politics stigmatizes the notion of populism, not only because of its association with nationalism and even racism, but because the political institution is viscerally opposed to any direct intervention of popular masses in the field of politics, which would, so we are told, distort the play of constitutional rules and put democracy itself at risk. In the eyes of the privileged elites, such a notion is also an obstacle which makes it more difficult to adopt and carry on unpopular policies. So what very often the category populism designates, while referring to innumerable examples of demagogic and dictatorial regimes serving as alibi, perhaps the name Chavez is here the best and last example, is also, in fact, a supplement or an excess of democracy with respect to its oligarchic and elitist definitions, which involves active participation, protests, campaigns, extra-parliamentary, spontaneous or organized mass movement. And this country, just as Europe, is not poor in records of such moments and movements. But in the absence of such movements, democracy soon becomes an abstract word, if not a mystification. Democracy requires the crystallization, the visibility of the demos or the multitude, in other terms, the majority, which it officially represents, not to suppress the parliamentary and representative institutions in general, the division of powers, the protection of individual rights and the rights of minorities, but to recreate an equilibrium of social forces, the possibility of a more egalitarian access to power, compensating the influence of economic power, wealth, social relations based on expertise and professional hierarchies, on family ties and academic solidarities, in short, on class membership. The current developments in our European countries, especially in the field of economic and social policies, eloquently illustrate the consequences of the complete imbalance of forces between the oligarchy and the majority. Nobody is really able to dispute the decisions which are proposed or imposed by governments or global or transnational administrations, whose main effect is to transfer onto the ordinary people the burden of debts which have been generated by the anarchic speculation on the markets or the irresponsible budgetary decisions of governments. This is generally designated euphemistically as a democratic deficit of our officially democratic regimes, which was blatant in the Greek case, but is no less observable when other European governments, including the French, the Spanish, the German, the British, adopt austerity policies which are very far from the programs to which they had committed themselves at the time of the elections, in particular because they neglect the dramatic questions of poverty and unemployment. I should avoid misunderstandings here. Nobody who is serious will dispute the fact that critical circumstances may impose changes, even reversals of political orientations. But you cannot consider that it is democratic to carefully exclude the population from the information and the discussion when it comes to determining the content and the extension of the changes. Take the example of the conflict on retirement age and pensions today in France, which has equivalents in other countries. By the way, if you read this morning's New York Times, there is an editorial precisely on that, France, the unions, and fiscal reality. Would be worth discussing in detail. And what holds at the national level is even truer at the supranational or communitarian level, where some of the most decisive measures are taken. For want of a European democracy, including debates in the population and the emergence of parties in the broad sense, mobilizing citizens across the borders, what you only have are negotiations, not to say bargaining, among national governments and politicians who are much more interested in flattering the prejudices of their electoral bases than in encouraging their actual participation. We have to do here with a permanent flaw of the European Union. Perhaps it is not the only cause why the democratic life within each nation tends now to degenerate or become blocked, but certainly it does nothing to improve the situation. Governments, I don't believe that the amount of democracy in the national and supranational arena is something like a system of communicating vases. If you have less democracy at the European level, you'll have more at the national level, and conversely, it's just the opposite. When you have less at the supranational level, you also have less at the national level, and conversely, this is what we observe. Governments use the European institutions when they find it convenient, in particular to picture the political choices as technical imperatives or constraints imposed by the supranational bureaucracy, but they ignore or downplay them when something like a transnational public sphere seems to be emerging, which they would not control. There was never a question for the European Parliament to seriously examine the financial bailouts or the articulation of monetary and budgetary policies in Europe. The Parliament in this sense is even less than an advisory body. This is a fear, or as my colleague and friend Jacques Rancière would put it, a hatred of democracy, which proves terribly self-destructive. In the long run, it leads to a complete loss of legitimacy for politics, the governmental and representative institutions themselves, whether at the national or the European level, since the two, as I said just a minute ago, cannot be separated. For that reason, it has become the task of the peoples, which taken together form a virtual demos at the European level, to revive the democratic principle without which there is no possibility of a legitimate government and of stable institutions, which means that the national peoples must loudly reject the policies based on the continuation of privileges or even their development in the context of the crisis. This is why I spoke of the need of a European populism which is not the opposite of civic values and commitments, but its complementary side in a given critical conjuncture. In other terms, I am far from ignoring that the most visible and active forms of populism today in Europe, rapidly expanding throughout the continent, have nothing to do with the peaceful insurrection of citizens coming from different countries in the name of democracy in order to remove the oligarchic structures. As we know, it is mainly a nationalistic and local populism, strongly xenophobic, even potentially murderous with respect to alien populations. The migrants, especially those who come from the other side of the Mediterranean, and the Islamic cultures, but also the Romani nomads, perhaps even the Jews, and in many cases the other Europeans, pitting against one another people from the north and the south, or the east and the west of the continent, sometimes the culturally or economically diverse regions within the same nation, as you can observe in Italy or in Belgium. But there is another form of populism that is equally destructive of democracy, which is dramatically illustrated by the Berlusconi type of government, and now also increasingly the Sarkozy type in France. This is a populism of the media, as my friend and colleague Giacomo Mavramao, professor at University Roma III, Rome 3, calls it, whose technologies of the manipulation of the mass media recall in a soft manner the past examples of the fascist era. Is it so soft? We too have the equivalents, of course, of your Rush Limbaughs in Europe. All these are reactionary populisms, echoing each other throughout the continent, which express the deep demoralization of popular classes and the middle class, but also result from cynical maneuvers of the ruling classes and ultimately the lack of a post-national perspective to confront the tendencies of globalization in an active manner and the shrinking of social movements against the absolute rule of profits. The question thus becomes, is it thinkable that they can be resisted and defeated only through a moral predication of humanist values, anti-racist lessons of history, a theoretical defense of the benefits of the rule of law and the liberal civilization, but without ever touching the mass inequalities and the crushing domination of corporate interests and financial networks? I don't believe so. On the contrary, I think that we need a genuine popular surge, which initially must take the form of a protest against the type of society in which the majority lives today. But I'm fully aware that there is a huge risk involved in such formulations, reason why I insist simultaneously on the need of a commitment to democratic principles and the need of a reformist program which does not limit itself to stigmatizing the oligarchies and their contempt for the majority, but opens constructive perspectives, especially in the economic and social realm. Do I have something like another 15 minutes, or is that busy? Yes? You agree? No, be sincere, because I could stop there.
Okay.
And leave my second point aside. Thank you. This leads me to discuss, always in the form of working hypotheses, the issue of the relationship between politics and the economy. The first difficulty here comes from the fact that if we are not professional political experts, we believe, nevertheless, to understand something of the political processes qua citizens, whereas most of us feel disarmed before the complexity of the economic choices. We're continuously led to accept simultaneously the idea that the economy sets the absolute condition of politics and that they belong to separated realms. But isn't this precisely an ideological representation? The dominant discourse has developed a whole series of categories to carefully hide a fact that the recent crisis nevertheless has brought back into the open. The fact that everything in the economy is political, just as everything in politics is economically determined. I'm not thinking here only of the broad preconditions or the after effects, but of the processes themselves and their intrinsic contradictions. They do not obey natural or mechanical laws. They consist of relationships of forces, and they open bifurcations, choices, if you prefer. Let me try and be more precise before I conclude by returning to the lessons of the conjuncture that I was evoking in relation to the Greek crisis and its origins. It is widely acknowledged that the political choices after the American subprime crisis have not cancelled the risk of financial crash, but disseminated them, in particular through transference of the debts from the private banking sector to the public treasury and the national economies. But this seems to involve more fundamental structural lessons which concern the articulation of state and capitalist market. A first lesson is that the crisis of public finances, be it in the case of Greece, or Spain, or Britain, or France, have nothing to do with a pure quantitative or budgetary calculus which would yield absolute, objective, indisputable results. In practice, it entirely depends on momentary decisions without a single decider, of course, made by the financial markets, the ratings of their agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and so on, their evaluation of the capacities of states to keep repaying the interests of their debts, and the rates of interest imposed on them when they need to borrow on the financial market in order to be able to continue paying previous interest. The more difficult it is for a country to face its obligations, the higher the cost of money becomes for it. As a consequence, there is a fluctuation in the debt of states which affects their autonomy, ultimately their degree of sovereignty. The states are rated by the financial markets as private firms or communities would be. Now, the markets are anything but an impersonal and disinterested mechanism. They're largely controlled by great banks and speculative funds, or in any case, for want of real regulation, they mainly serve their interests. In that sense, banks and hedge funds have become political actors in the strong sense, quasi-sovereign actors, in fact, since they can impose to states, central banks, and governments the terms of their economic and monetary policies, social also. Clearly, this has devastating consequences on the capacity of traditional political bodies, such as peoples or nations of citizens, to choose and determine their own development. It would seem that the only country today in the world which partially escapes this inverted relationship between the public and the private is the virtually hegemonic Chinese empire, but certainly not the United States of America. Renowned French economist Michel Aglietta has recently insisted that there is no conciliation possible between the two opposite logics of the regulation for the regulation of financial markets. But others concur with him on the same point. Either the public authority imposes rules of precaution and transparency on the speculative operations, or it is the unlimited demand for liquidities which produces a quasi-absolute deregulation. But there is no middle. This is a political alternative in the field of the economy through the intervention of finance, which can be properly compared to a conflict of rival sovereignties. A crucial observation in this respect, however, is that in the current age of globalization, the public authority which is likely to regulate the financial operations and control the banks in the public interest is not necessarily the nation state or its stock exchange regulating agencies. Of course, there are states which prefer to completely serve the logic of the market, particularly to keep their function as international places of trade. One thinks of the City of London, and they would never call this officially a retreat in their sovereignty. On the contrary, they present it as a form of resistance to the abusive intrusion or imperialism of the Brussels authorities. But above all, there is this difficulty which Europe clearly does not solve, namely the fact that even wealthy nation states are no longer in a position to to effectively regulate the markets by themselves, isolated from one another. Supranational or transnational regulations with a power of control and coercion would be necessary, which nobody either knows how to install or wants to install. There's a European Central Bank, but there's no European equivalent of the SEC. But there is another face to this competition among states on the background of a globalization process dominated by financial logics, which also affect the relationship between the national policies aiming at developing the competitive power of territories, their capacity to attract floating capital, and the level of social inequalities. I'm speaking of inequality of salaries, welfare benefits, therefore the quality of life in general, which are correlated to the policies of lowering salaries, developing the insecurity of employment through the use of underpaid migrant labor, and to the competition among tax regimes, which in the long term inevitably affect the social services and the social security. It would seem that in this respect the states are regaining at least part of their sovereign capacity to politically decide the economic conditions of politics, which a moment ago I said was slipping into the hands of financial private actors. Clearly, depending on their political orientation, states in today's world either put the emphasis on the conservation of a certain model of social security, or they tend to privilege the capacity to export cheaper goods and keep or increase their commercial standing. But obviously this possibility of choice is taking place between very narrow limits. On the one side, there's the fact that a model of social and economic development supported by the state cannot be chosen at will, independent of the place that a state occupies in the world economy, and apart from the similar choices made by other states, which sometimes are much more powerful. And on the other side, there's the fact that the political choices affecting social inequalities, which in the end will produce either the inclusion or the exclusion of whole populations, are more or less easily tolerated by the citizens. In other terms, they are not exposed only to the hazard of international competition, but also to the effects of what, until recently, Marxists and some others designated with the name of class struggles. I thought that these general considerations, however imperfect technically, on the combination of economic and political constraints revealed by the crisis, were necessary to address the difficulty that is involved in the discourse developed in particular by neo-Keynesian economists and politicians, rather influential on the left, and backed from outside by such, in Europe, by such influential theorists as, for example, Paul Krugman or Joseph Stiglitz from Columbia University. They have insisted that a coalition of states like Europe should increase its capacity to limit systemic risks and regulate the financial market. They have criticized a mere perspective of the reduction of deficit, a politics of deflation and more or less controlled depression, as it is advocated by neoliberal orthodoxy to eliminate the bulk of accumulated debts, and suggest, on the other side, a new institutional capacity of governing the economy in the general interest. A voluntaristic policy of counter-cyclical growth supported by the public budgets. My feeling is that such proposals, which certainly are not absurd and would be in the interest of the majority, are very difficult to implement conceivably without a radical break with the existing regime of political and economic power, which, seen from the angle of democracy, I called oligarchic a moment ago. The fact is that the real power is now again largely displaced out of its official, juridical, administrative, and parliamentary sites. What the fashionable term governance mainly covers is the development of a shadow constitution of power, which was best illustrated by the way in which the IMF and certain European governments cooperated in the definition of the financial rescue plan imposed on the Greek government and people. But it is equally difficult to implement these reformist policies if a tendency towards increasing inequalities among populations keeps developing as a consequence of globalization, not only outside the European continent, but now increasingly inside its limits, both in terms of national territories and in terms of regions and sectors or sectors of activity. You cannot think, in fact, that you will increase the degree of competition among the European populations without also inevitably increase the level of inequalities, potentially disruptive as they are apparently framed in national categories. Ultimately, the political changes required to implement reformist economic policies are so radical that two conclusions are possible. Either a neo-Keynesian perspective, including in particular a conservation of the welfare, the existing welfare system, or what remains of the welfare system, is a complete utopia in the framework of neoliberal globalization as we observe it today. Or reformist policies are indiscernible from a break with the capitalist system, in other terms, a revival of what I would call, with a clin d'oeil to my friend Alain Badiou, the socialist hypothesis, albeit with forms that remain to be invented, in particular to eliminate the specter of socialism in one country, which is still looming. Now, I have little doubt personally that regulatory ideas and ideals with a socialist or even a communist character are needed to invent a policy or a program which would counter the domination of financial capital on the economy and the social life, particularly if we refer the idea of communism to its etymological root, the notion of the common interest, common good, action and thinking in common, as suggested today, among others, by Antonio Negri. But I would not like to enter speculations on this theme, which I don't think has much immediate utility. I prefer to somewhat switch the debate in order to conclude, these are really my last developments, to the discussion of the forces involved in a struggle around different ways to confront the crisis, which will either solve it or aggravate it, and above all, will not benefit the same elements of society. This, in a sense, will take me back to exactly the same issue of democracy and populism that I had discussed a moment ago, albeit from a different angle. I said that the specter of the class struggle is more than ever hovering over the transformations of the relationship between the state and the market. However, it seems to me extremely unlikely that the forces or the camps confronting each other in a political battle for democracy involving antithetic kinds of populism could be described simply as classes in the traditional Marxist sense, or even as class alliances, as post-Gramscian theorists like Nikos Poulantzas suggested some 30 years ago. But they can also not become pictured in terms of an apocalyptic antithesis between entities like the empire and the multitude, or a mass of the people who would just be awaiting a political program or an ideological symbol to revolt against the tyranny of Wall Street. Things are more complicated, it seems to me, and for that reason as well, the political perspectives are much more uncertain, which is one of the reasons why a leftist imaginary for which the binary representations of social conflict are quasi-foundational finds itself so disturbed and disarmed, which in turn tends periodically to precipitate the socialists or the social democrats into the traps and the dead ends of the so-called third ways. Why is it not as simple as a binary concept of antagonistic forces would suggest? It is not, I believe, because the masses have been mystified by dominant ideologies like nationalism or religion, fundamentalism, if you like, however misleading and damaging or nuisible. How's that? You said that in English? Nocive. They can be. It is also not because here and there the state and more generally the bureaucracies, not to forget the powerful corporations, create networks of dependency or corruption which profoundly permeate the society and destroy the civic spirit, although it would be silly to deny that this phenomenon is very real. But I think that a much more decisive factor comes from the fact that the life of the mass or the multitude is profoundly integrated in the fabric of financial capital. From the point of view of its employment, more or less precarious, its daily conditions of life, its consumption, its culture, its survival in the complete sense of the term. Some of our contemporaries use the term biopolitics to designate this dependency, but it would be another discussion. To say that there is integration is not to say that there is no antagonism, that the material interests of the masses are the same as those of financial capital, or represent a minor function of them. It is to reject the old idea that of the financial capital as a parasitic capital, a notion that was developed in the 19th century as a reaction against the scandals of financial speculation, which have indeed their equivalent today on an even larger scale, and under the influence of the productivist ideology of the Industrial Revolution, which Marxism, in fact, largely shared. What the subprime crisis demonstrated in particular was the fact that the most elementary conditions of life, what to parody Agamben I'm tempted to call bare life, such as housing for the poorest members of the population in the United States, but also in Britain or other countries, is immediately dependent on the access to credit facilities, which itself forms the large and largely fictitious basis of the speculations of the banks and insurance companies, so that individuals and masses of individuals who are excluded, rejected into the margins by the system, are also, in a sense, even more tightly integrated into it. We could borrow the expression inclusive exclusion proposed in other contexts. Or to quote another recent example, when the behemoth of oil industry called British Petroleum was threatened with penalties by the US administration because it was held responsible of the ecological catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico, as soon as the market value of its stocks seemed to vacillate, the huge pension funds which owned these stocks rang the alarm bell and could present themselves as speaking in the interest of the ordinary people. To describe all these facts, we could use the expression that Marx had coined in a marginal corner of his manuscript preparatory for Das Kapital, but left largely unemployed, that of the real subsumption of the workers and more generally the population under the process of accumulation of capital. This became really significant and altered the patterns of social conflict only when the primacy of industrial capital was replaced by the primacy of financial capital, and the latter had established an intimate association with the structures of mass consumption, covering the life and culture of the whole population, including the poor. It is always on the side of the poor that there is money to be harvested for the rich, even if the poor have no money, only debts. Which consequences are we going to derive from this hypothesis? First of all, it seems to me the conclusion that there is no exteriority of the interests of capital and the interests of the population, an idea that is still shared by many reformists who are not radicals or communists themselves. Again, this does not mean that there is no antagonism or no contradiction, but antagonisms are not vertical. They are traversing the forms of life, the patterns of activity and consumption, the interests, and accordingly the forms of consciousness of the social groups. There is a struggle undoubtedly, but which does not so much separate pre-existing groups, defined in quantitative terms, than antagonistic ways of socializing or collectivizing the interests of individuals. And to some extent, these individuals are the same. They belong to the same classes, or the same nations, or the same professions. Each time, incompatible ways of governing the society with an economic, a political, and also a moral dimension are involved. One is tempted here to borrow a Gramscian formula and suggest that the conflict is among alternative hegemonies and corresponding historical blocks, which does not only mean that certain interests have primacy over others, such as competition or solidarity, financial accumulation or sustainable growth, imperial domination or the hybridation of cultures, etc. But that individuals and social groups can make a choice between different ways of life, different modes of survival. Of course, this kind of choice is not really free. It heavily depends on the conditions created by the place where you are located in the world, which is itself highly conflictual and hierarchic. Whether Europe, not giving in advance any specific limit to that, the extension of that name, could prove to be the place or one of the places where a similar choice remains meaningful, is something I'm not able to decide myself, of course. Thank you very much. On schedule, I've been very long as always.
We have 30 minutes of questions. Is there a question right there?
It's very hard to pose a simple question after a very complex presentation, but I'll try.
I'm sure you.
Are you describing the collapse of Europe, or are you describing the final collapse of capitalism, which is to say has non-European integration and the European model that we've experienced over the last 50 years been primarily a capitalist enterprise? And the second question, that is an enterprise dominated by the oligarchy and the banks and those who run the system and have run it. And the second point that I would make is, do we not confuse the financial system and the economy? There is a real economy of exchanges between human beings and the work we do. And then there is the manipulation of vast amounts of currency, much of which is fictitious and can disappear in a moment, as happened in the recent subprime crisis in the United States, where $7 trillion of wealth disappeared from one day to the next. The wealth, the actual real wealth, didn't disappear. It was the money that disappears. And so much of the financial manipulation and crisis that you see in Greece and now which has spread to France is over real issues which take a mystified financial form. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. This is anything but a simple question. It's very clear, but it's not simple. May I ask if you're an economist yourself? I'm not. I mean,
No, I'm not an economist, I'm a
Okay,
historian.
we'll try. Okay, on the first point, very brutally and certainly in a manner that can be challenged. Since you propose an alternative, is this a collapse of the European Union, the European project, or is this a collapse of the capitalist system, after which you go to the understanding of the capitalist system as such? My preferred answer, the one I'm more leaning to, is the first. It's a collapse of it's a collapsing of the European political project. It's not a collapsing of the capitalist system. I absolutely don't believe that the capitalist system has reached once again or finally the famous moment of Zusammenbruch, as German Marxists explained in the 19th century. And in fact, okay, so of course that opens a wide range of questions. I would like to make a distinction between the European Union as a system of institutions and what I call the European political project, which I consider to have been always, in fact, the result of very contradictory tendencies, not all of them capitalist. Some of them you might want to call purely ideological, or etc. Without which I tend to believe the institutions themselves, however inert, they have inertia, and they also have become indispensable in many respects of the functioning of European societies. My friend Uli Bielefeld from the Hamburg Institute für Sozialforschung is writing simultaneously. We exchange our draft chapters. So he's not interested in my hypothesis at all, because he believes in the, say, increasing consistency of the European society as a sort of tissue, if you like, a combination of practices and cultural transformations which are not bound by the boundaries. And I don't think this is absurd or unreal. And I understand that the institutions of the European Union are now very profoundly woven into the fabric of the society itself. But I tend, and we could take examples, and we should take examples, but I tend to believe that the institutions become incredibly fragilized and weakened if the political project itself collapses or becomes meaningful. And to put it in very, very general terms, I hope I made this clear, the political project, limited, reduced to its simplest formulation, is to have common political and therefore, of course, also social, economic, etc. interests prevail over the competition between the different member states, which takes me to the next aspect, and I will conclude. If you like, our colleague who mentioned to me the work of my student Céline Jouin on the dubious figure of Carl Schmitt is still here in the audience. Allow me to quote this dangerous man. There's a book called like that. Just to borrow the title of his last and perhaps greatest book, the nomos of the earth. That meant a law, two meanings of the Greek nomos, a law of the world or for the world, and of course, nomos, as he interprets it, meaning also dividing, and a division of the world. Of course, that was borrowed from the old theory of imperialism developed by Hobson, Lenin, and others. Europe built itself as a center of the world, so to speak, through a practice of division of the whole world into colonies or semi-colonies, etc., while at the same time, internally, of course, having its powers, its great powers, struggling against one another. What we witness today, I tend to believe, to put it in very simple terms, is a complete reversal of that situation. The effects of globalization, which in that sense the European Union virtually at least should, if not abolish, counteract or regulate, seem now to have entirely prevailed, so that in fact Europe is more than ever a legal and commercial and financial and monetary system to make to the free competition possible, and absolutely not a system of solidarity or a common interest. So we are likely to see the conflicts, social conflicts maybe, but the conflicts among European nations increasingly prevail. At least this is a possibility if we don't do anything over this solidarity. This is also one of the reasons why, when I discussed with Hubert Védrine, who had just published, and he's not the only one to say that, I just published a loud, noisy article in Le Monde explaining when the French-German couple, so-called, does not work well, Europe cannot maintain its political project. So let's recreate it. I don't believe in that. I absolutely don't believe that the German-French couple, as so-called joint hegemony, will become recreated. Now, excuse me, this is too long. On the second half, which is the same, real economy and fictitious economy, I'm not an economist myself. I read as much as I can, and I learn from friends and colleagues. In favor of your argument is the fact, on which I tried to insist as much as I could, that the problem was not only the deregulation of financial markets and the effects of speculation, but it was a new division of labor at the world level. Or better said, the combination of a new division of labor and new patterns of inequalities, of social inequalities, both inside the nations and among the nations. This is not to raise, once again, the Chinese specter, although, of course, in this country, I can see that this is becoming increasingly a concern. And Paul Krugman, whom I was mentioning a moment ago, now writes almost an article per week, which means beware of China, But this is the new division of labor. It's the new pattern of inequalities, and they have complex effects, of course. On the other hand, I'm not sure that we can keep the distinction between the real and the fictitious. I agree that the real is real, but I'm not sure that the fictitious is unreal. And that's, of course, a long discussion concerning, and in this sense, Marxism is of no help. Although Marx himself, this is a fascinating story, ever since the financial bubbles started to grow and blow up in the middle of the 19th century, he tried to understand the mechanisms and explain them. But in the last analysis, he had to resort, I put it very brutally, he had to resort to moral, what many of our contemporaries do.
The operative word was fetishism.
Exactly. In order to explain, and he insisted on the fact that in the end the real would prevail. So immoral speculators who make money, in French we call that cavalerie, which is a very eloquent term. They're riding their horse ahead of the real economy into the void, and put, of course, their ordinary people at risk, will crash, and the real will prevail. But what is neglected or shifted to the domain of moral is the importance of psychological factors in the economy. And other economists, of course, are of better help, I think, in that respect. Keynes in particular, but I'm not an expert. Any questions?
Hi, thank you for that fascinating talk. You spoke very eloquently about the problem of the financial crash of the recent years in relation to this EU political project, and the sort of bureaucratic and oligarchic nature of many of the European political institutions. But you didn't talk much, or at all, if I remember, about EU enlargement, which is obviously one of the most significant changes in the structure of the European Union over the last 20 years or so. So I wonder how that plays into your thesis about the end or the crisis in the political project, in that we've seen such a significant expansion eastwards, in particular, of the European Union since 1989, or the period after the end of the fall of nationalism and communism.
Not Joe the plumber, but the Polish plumber.
That's right.
Yes. Who remembers Joe the plumber in this in this country?
We all
Okay.
forget. We all do.
Okay. Well, I'm sure you're right. The interaction of political factors and social and other factors, including and the place in the global economy are constantly changing shape, but always decisive. I agree. Now, I think that the whole story of the relationship of between the two parts of Europe and in past has to be rewritten. In fact, it has to be written. It has to be written starting early, not in 1989, of course. And of course, it will include, of necessity, the extremely delicate question, highly symbolically very tense question of where Europe ends, if it ends somewhere. Some years ago, on the cover of a book I had published called Les Frontières de la Démocratie, I tried to draw a map of how I tried to understand the issue of the borders of Europe. Nothing such as an external absolute border, also not a sort of core, plus a periphery, but a sort of permanent overlapping of say map in English, spaces or etc., which extend to the rest of the world. So is Russia part of Europe? In a sense, absolutely. Is Turkey part of Europe? Absolutely. Is Britain part of Europe? Of course, but this is not always obvious. I always remember allow me this quick parenthesis, the extraordinary passages at the beginning of Lord Keynes' early book, The Economic Consequences of Peace, and we're again absolutely in that, where he starts like this. You might find it surprising, I quote of memory, that somebody who is not European himself, who was a member of the English delegation and the peace treaties and so on, would feel concerned about the future of economic European people, depending on which political and diplomatic and economic dispositions would be made. Indeed, the European peoples are the French, the Russian, the German. I always said the Turkish, but it's not in the text. I'm sorry. It would have been wonderful, but it's not the case. And not Britain, which is part of another, etc. But of course, this I don't agree with the idea that Britain is not European, but it's okay. We have these overlapping, and then the history of the. So as somebody who had spent 20 years in the Communist Party on the West, until 81, that's long ago. I'm no longer checked at the American border entrance for that. It used to be. I have a particular sensitivity, can you say that? A sensibility to this issue. And I tended to see not the Polish plumber as a peril, but the effects of the collapse of the Soviet regime, however unexpected for many the form it would take, as a sort of reunification of Europe. Then, of course, and that to some extent ideologically obfuscated, so to speak, my capacities to reflect on the increase of contradictions or tensions that it produced. But I don't believe that the increase in contradictions pure and simply came from the fact that the different parts of Europe had different stories and different paths. That coincided, in fact, with a turn, if not a break, in the history of the world economy, the global economy, the pace of the globalization. So when I speak of populism, blah blah, necessity of democratic counter forces, one of the main ideas that I have in mind is that the current gap, it's not quite as simple as that, but ideological, psychological gap between the two parts of Europe, or between the different parts of Europe. You have the East-West problem, but you have the North-South problem as well. We spoke of Greece. And one of the interests of the last crisis should be bridged, and it should be bridged in the form of inventing some sort of common strategy. There are bases for that. One of the effects of the Greek crisis was to bring back, again, of course, our friends who are from Greece or work on Greece, etc., or have ties with Greece, know that perfectly, but others, like me, for example, had completely ignored that or forgotten it, about the truth about the conditions in which Greece and the other southern European countries liberated from their dictatorships were included into Europe. What you read in the newspapers, for example, are things like it's very aggressive. In fact, the Greek problem existed always since the origin, because the Greeks were not forced to comply with the rules, the complete rules of the Eurozone and so on. But then there is the reverse, the other side of that, which is that Greece, Portugal and so on were integrated in Europe for political reasons. both internal, having to do with their political regimes, and external, having to do with the defense of the NATO, etc. It's always been a political and economic problem at the same time. And my only suggestion is that we don't hear enough the voice of the peoples themselves in that debate. Now, of course, you'll ask me, do the peoples have a voice? And if they have a voice, what do they say? Thank you for the question.
Take one more question.
Perhaps,
in terms of the current crisis in France,
take two.
I'm curious, because on the face of it to me, if the unions were to concede the retirement age to 62, it doesn't seem to me so terrible given the American system.
Now that's this morning's editorial in the New York Times. I have something to say about it. Go ahead.
But my question is, I assume that you may think, or I shouldn't assume, I just wonder if you see that concession by the unions as opening the door to more and more concessions.
Opening the doors to?
More and more concessions and making it kind of a disaster for them in terms of their political situation. But I'm curious as to your